I still remember the first time I saw him. Not as the legend he'd become, not as the feared phantom of Yellowstone. Just a pup. Broken. Bleeding. And crying for help in the middle of a forest so deep, it felt like the end of the world. I was just a kid back then, maybe 12, maybe 13. It was a bitterly cold November morning. The kind where your breath turns to mist the second you exhale, and every step crunches beneath the weight of fresh snow. I was with my dad, Ranger Thomas Mercer. Everyone respected him. He was the kind of man who didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. We were out checking for illegal traps near the eastern edge of Lamar Valley, a place few dared to explore in the dead of winter. That morning, the silence was eerie. No birds. No distant howls. Just wind and snow. Then we heard it. A whimper. Sharp. Repeating. Not a howl. Not a bark. More like a sob. Something small. Scared. My dad stopped in his tracks. He raised his hand, signaling me to stay put. But you know how kids are. I followed anyway, stepping lightly, breath held. The sound grew louder as we approached a small, half-frozen stream. And that's when we saw him. A tiny black wolf pup, caught in a jagged steel trap, one of those old rusted contraptions banned for decades. His back paw was twisted at a sickening angle, matted with blood. He tried to snarl at us, poor thing, but it came out more like a whine. He was too young to be dangerous, too hurt to run. I remember how my dad knelt down slowly, talking softly like he did with spooked horses. He pulled off his gloves and reached for the trap. I thought the pup would bite, but he didn't. He just stared, panting, shivering. And then, something strange happened. As soon as the trap snapped open, the little guy collapsed into my dad's arms. That was the first time I touched him. His fur was coarse but warm, and even though he was scared, he let me stroke the silver streak running through his tail. That's why I named him Graytail. Now look what we did next. It wasn't exactly by the book. My dad could have called the Wildlife Bureau. Let them take the pup. But he didn't trust them. Said they'd study him to death. So instead, we took Graytail to an old ranger's cabin deep in the woods. It hadn't been used in years. That became his shelter. And our secret. We fed him bits of cooked venison, wrapped his leg, even built a little bed out of hay and old wool. And every day after school, I'd hike out there to visit him. Talk to him. Teach him how to chase sticks and follow whistles. He learned fast, too fast for a wild animal. It wasn't long before he started wagging his tail when I showed up. But wolves aren't meant to live in cabins. My dad reminded me of that almost daily. And then came the night we said goodbye. It was late January, the stars, so bright you could see your own shadow in the snow. We hiked out with Graytail, now healed and grown, to the edge of the forest, miles from any road. My dad whistled once. Then again. Graytail looked up at me, confused. I gave him one last hug, whispered, "You'll be okay," and let go. He took a few steps, turned around, and vanished into the trees. I never thought I'd see him again. But life has a funny way of looping back, doesn't it? Because 20 years later, I came face to face with him again. Only this time, he wasn't a pup. He was the last wolf of Yellowstone. You ever return to a place from your childhood and feel like everything's familiar, but nothing's the same? That's what it felt like when I came back to Yellowstone. 20 years had passed since I'd let Graytail go. In that time, I went to college, became a wildlife biologist, worked across a dozen national parks, but something always pulled me back here. Back to the valleys, the pine-covered ridges, the winding rivers. Back to the place I still called home. Only Yellowstone wasn't the same anymore. I remember stepping out of my old rusted Jeep at the ranger station. I could smell the cold pine in the air, feel the bite of wind cutting across my face, and for a moment, I swore I could hear a distant howl. But it wasn't there. That's the first thing that hit me, the silence. See, when I was a kid, Yellowstone was alive with sound. The coyotes yipped in the distance, elk bugled in the meadows, and the wolves. Oh, the wolves sang at night. It was like the whole forest breathed in unison with the pack. But now? Nothing. No prints in the snow. No droppings. No kills. Just silence. I asked around. Older rangers shook their heads. They're all gone. One of them told me. Poachers got the last big pack near Eagle Peak. The rest? Scattered. Vanished. They'd reintroduced wolves to the park back in the 90s, and for a while, it worked. The ecosystem had started to heal. But politics changed. Laws were loosened. Ranchers got angry. And when fear walks in, bullets tend to follow. The wolves were being hunted again legally, illegally, it didn't seem to matter. A few nights after I returned, I was in my cabin reviewing some motion sensor camera data when I got a call from a rancher just outside the park boundary. He was furious. Something killed 2 of my cows, he barked. Tore him up. No meat taken. Just shredded. That ain't no bear. It's a damn wolf. I asked the usual questions. Were there tracks? Claw marks? Fur? He didn't know. He just wanted it dead. If you won't do something about it, I will. The next morning, I drove out to the ranch to take a look for myself. Now, I've seen wolf kills before. This wasn't one. Not a clean one anyway. Bears usually maul. Cougars suffocate. Wolves, they're precise. Strategic. But this? It looked personal. The cows weren't eaten. Just attacked. Mauled. As if someone or something was sending a message. That's when I spotted the tracks. Light. Elongated. Deep in the snow. Wolf tracks. But not from a pack. Just one. A lone wolf. Now here's the part that chilled me. The front left paw was slightly dragged. Just enough to leave a faint groove in the snow. Like the leg was stiff. Like it had once been injured. I froze. There's no way. I told myself it couldn't be. It was just coincidence. Maybe a sprained leg, a deformity. But deep down something stirred. I followed those tracks for about half a mile until they disappeared into thick forest. I stood there for a while, staring into the woods, my heart pounding like I was 12 again. Could it be him? Could Greytail have survived all this time? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure. That silence I heard when I came back, it wasn't emptiness. It was waiting. Because something wild still lived in Yellowstone. And it wasn't ready to be forgotten. I started seeing him everywhere, but never with my eyes. Only his signs. That's how it began. For the next few weeks, I became obsessed with that trail I'd found near the ranch. I went back out almost every day, sometimes before dawn, sometimes under moonlight. I followed paw prints through snowbanks, examined tree bark for claw scrapes, listened in silence for anything that broke the stillness of the forest. I wasn't just chasing an animal. I was chasing a ghost. He moved like smoke, there one day, gone the next. My motion cameras caught only flickers, a shadow slipping through the trees, glowing eyes in the distance, a blur of black fur vanishing behind brush. Locals began whispering again, the way they did when I was a kid. They called him the Phantom of Lamar. Some swore he could pass through fences. Others said he hunted only on stormy nights. A few even believed he was the spirit of a dead ranger reborn as a beast. You know how stories grow when no one knows the truth. But I was starting to piece something together. It was subtle at first. I noticed claw marks on trees, too deliberate to be random, for clean slashes. Always at eye level. Always on the north-facing side of the trunk. Like markers. Waypoints. Wolves don't normally do that. At least not like this. Then I found something that froze me in my tracks. It was early morning. The fog was thick, the ground half melted from an overnight rain. I was walking near the Firelight River, not far from the old ranger trails, when I stumbled upon a mound of fresh earth beneath an aspen tree. At first I thought it was just a den site. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't dug into the ground. It was piled up. Someone or something had buried something there. I hesitated, then carefully brushed away a bit of the topsoil with a stick. There, beneath the damp dirt, I saw what looked like bones. Tiny bones. Pup bones. My chest tightened. I dropped the stick and stood up, heart racing. Around the mound, the snow was covered in paw prints, dozens of them, but only one set was fresh. One wolf had returned here recently, and he'd stayed long enough to mourn. I sat by the tree for a long time. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched the wind stir through the trees and thought about him, Graytail, returning to the only place he'd ever known as safe. The old ranger's cabin was only a mile from there. And that's when it hit me. He remembered. After all those years, he remembered. I went back to the cabin the next day. It was still there, barely holding together. The roof had caved in. The windows were missing. But inside, everything was the same. The little wood stove, the broken cot, the wall where I carved our initials, E+G in a crooked heart, back when I thought that sort of thing was clever. And on the floor, near the fireplace, the patch of black fur. Fresh. He'd been there. Graytail had come back. But not for me. Not for food. He came back because he had nowhere else to go. He'd lost something, someone. Maybe a mate. Maybe pups. And now he was the last of his kind. A ghost. A memory. But still watching. Still there. And I made a promise that day, standing in that ruined cabin, the scent of wild fur still clinging to the walls. If he was alive, I was going to find him, not to trap him, not to tag him, not to tame him, just to see him. One last time. You ever feel like you're being watched? Not in a paranoid way, but that old, primal sense. Like something's just beyond the edge of your vision. Silent. Still. Waiting. That feeling started following me. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been spending my nights in the woods, setting up trail cams, tracking every movement through the eastern ridges, living off gas station coffee and jerky. But then it started happening too often to ignore. I'd be crouched over some tracks and I'd feel it. That chill at the back of my neck. That breathless silence when all the birds vanish. And every time I'd turn to look, nothing. Until the night, I saw the eyes. It was a cold, clear evening. No wind, no snow, just stars overhead and a fire crackling beside me. I'd set up camp a few miles west of the ranger's cabin, near a bend in the river where deer came to drink. I figured if Graytail was still hunting, he'd pass through here. I wasn't even expecting anything that night. I was just sitting by the fire, boots off, half asleep, when I caught something odd. The silence had changed. The woods weren't empty. They were listening. And then, across the fire, maybe 30 feet away, two eyes. Not glowing like in movies. Just catching the light. Reflecting it back at me in that unmistakable amber hue. My body locked. I didn't move. Didn't blink. My breath hung in front of me like smoke. For a full minute, we just stared at each other. And I knew. It was him. I didn't need a closer look. Didn't need to see the scarred leg or the silver tail. That presence, that heavy, silent presence, it was Graytail. He hadn't forgotten me. But he didn't come closer either. He stood there in the dark, half shadow, half memory. And just like 20 years ago, I could feel that mix of fear and trust between us. A thread, pulled tight across time. I whispered his name. Graytail. His ears flicked. Just once. Then, like mist, he disappeared into the trees. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching those trees, hoping he'd return. He didn't. But in the morning, when I stepped outside my tent, I found something in the snow. A rabbit, freshly killed, left just a few feet from the fire pit. A gift. He remembered. He remembered everything. That changed everything. I wasn't just tracking a wild wolf anymore. I was sharing a conversation with him. One without words. One built on instinct, memory, and something deeper than science. The next few days, I changed my approach. I stopped carrying the tranquilizer rifle. Stopped marking trails with synthetic scent. I started walking the same paths we used to take when he was a pup, past the stream, up the ridge, down through the berry thicket. I started finding more signs. Scat near the edge of the firelight cabin. A freshly dug bed in the old clearing. Scratch marks. Just 3 this time, instead of 4, on a pine tree near the ridge. That was the moment I realized. He wasn't just moving randomly. He was leaving messages. Graytail was guiding me. Somewhere. Maybe back to where it all began. Or maybe forward, to something I wasn't ready for yet. But either way, we were no longer 2 separate lives, accidentally overlapping. We were walking the same path again. And whatever was waiting at the end of that path, it wasn't going to be easy, because a storm was coming, not just the kind that tears through trees, but the kind that tears through everything you thought you understood. The storm came 3 days later. Not just wind and snow, but something darker. I was out checking the far cameras along the eastern ridge, about 10 miles from the Lamar Valley, when the radio crackled to life. It was Ranger Molly. She rarely used the emergency frequency unless something serious was going down. "Eli, we got a fire near the west tree line. Could be deliberate." That word, deliberate, hit me like a punch. I dropped everything and drove. Hard. By the time I reached the area, smoke was curling through the pine canopy and flames were licking at the lower brush like hungry fingers. Not huge yet, but enough to spook every living thing for miles. Molly was there with 2 volunteers, stomping and spraying at the fire line. "We think someone started it last night. Accelerant. Fast burn. Just out of nowhere." I knew what that meant. Someone was trying to smoke something out. Or someone. My heart dropped into my stomach. Graytail. I ran the ridgeline, searching for any sign that he'd passed through. I was frantic, stumbling over roots, shouting his name like an idiot. Ash fell like black snow. The wind howled through the trees. Then, near a bend in the ridge, I found the tracks. Fresh. Wide paw prints pressed deep into soot and mud, heading away from the fire. But something was off. They were erratic. Not like before, smooth and deliberate. These were staggered, messy, dragged. He was hurt. I followed them for hours. Into the hills, past the treeline, down into the gorges where the sun barely touched the ground. The further I went, the more the snow returned. The smoke faded behind me, but the dread didn't. And then I saw it. Blood. Just a few drops. Bright against the white. My stomach turned. I picked up speed, crashing through branches, ignoring the sting of ice against my face. Finally, I reached a clearing. And there he was. Graytail. Lying half-curled beneath a fallen pine. His fur was scorched on one side, and his breathing was ragged. His leg, the old injury, was worse now. Maybe from running too hard. Maybe from something else. I knelt a few feet away. My voice cracked. "Gray, it's me." He raised his head slowly. His amber eyes met mine. There was no fear. Just recognition. And something else. Something resigned. Like he knew this was the last stop. I wanted to help. Every instinct in me screamed to patch him up, carry him out, get him back to a vet, anything. But I knew better. He wouldn't survive being taken again. He wouldn't let it happen. So I did the only thing I could. I sat down. And I stayed with him. I stayed as the snow thickened, as the forest quieted, as his breathing slowed, and his eyes stayed locked on the place where the sky meets the trees. And just before the wind shifted, he let out one final howl. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Low. Long, filled with memory. Filled with all the voices of the pack that was gone. Filled with the life he had lived, and the one he never got to finish. And then he was still. I buried him beneath that pine. Marked it with a pile of stones. And for the first time in years, I wept like that 12-year-old boy in the cabin again. I'd found him. I'd lost him. But I'd kept the promise. And in that frozen, fire-kissed forest, the last wolf of Yellowstone went home. It's strange what silence feels like after a howl. You'd think it would be peaceful, comforting even. But that night, sitting beside Graytail's grave, it was the kind of silence that echoes. The kind that doesn't end, just circles back through memory, through time. I stayed up until dawn. The world felt still, like Yellowstone itself was holding its breath. The sun rose slow and golden over the frost-covered trees, and for a moment, it looked like the valley was on fire again. Only this time with light, not destruction. I whispered something as the first rays hit his grave. "You were never lost, were you? You just went where we couldn't follow." Underscore 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 underscore. A week passed. The fire was ruled suspicious, but inconclusive. No charges. No leads. Typical. But the Rangers knew. I knew. Someone had wanted Greytail gone. The last wolf was more than a legend. He was a reminder of what we'd failed to protect, of what we'd allowed to disappear. I gave a report, of course. Dry words on paper. Lone wolf sighted. Injured. Presumed deceased. Just enough to document it. But the real story didn't belong in a file folder. It belonged in the wind, in the howl that still rang in my bones. Underscore 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 underscore. A month later, I went back to the Ranger's cabin, fixed the door, repaired the roof, not to move in, not really, just to give it back to him. I carved one last thing into the wall, beside that old heart-shaped mark from when I was a kid. Greytail, born wild, died free. And underneath it, I remember. Underscore 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 underscore. People still ask me if wolves are really gone from Yellowstone. I tell them this. Maybe the packs are gone. Maybe the sightings have dried up. But if you stand in Lamar Valley just after dusk, when the wind dies and the stars come out, you might still hear something. A whisper. A rustle. A howl too distant to trace. Because he's not entirely gone. He's in the soil. In the trees. In the air that flows through this wild place. And in a boy who once broke the rules for a pup with too much fight in him. You know, some say legends die when no one believes in them anymore. But not this one. Because every time someone tells the story, every time someone listens, the last wolf of Yellowstone runs again.